All right, welcome back to the deep dive. Today we're diving into the thought of a pretty key figure in 19th century Black American thought, a guy named Alexander Crummell.
Okay.
Now, Crummell was born in 1819, and he stands out even amongst an era that, was chock full of intellectual powerhouses,
Right.
like Frederick Douglass and Agilia Cooper.
Absolutely.
And, what I find particularly compelling about him, from our perspective as, I guess, people who think philosophically or whatever you want to call it, is that Crummell really emphasizes reason, right,
Yeah.
as just the bedrock of moral agency. And this, permeates his whole way of looking at things.
Oh, yeah.
Whether it's, language or, the whole sweep of history.
Yeah, absolutely.
So that's kind of where we're going today.
Definitely. And he's an interesting figure, too, because while a lot of his contemporaries were very focused on the more practical elements of social reform, like how do we achieve this now,
Right.
Crummell was kind of engaged in a much, I guess, deeper philosophical project.
Okay, yeah.
He really wanted to get at what is the role of reason, not just for individual morality, but for, the very structure of rights and, where are societies going? What's the trajectory of a society?
Right.
And his intellectual reach was huge.
Yeah.
I mean, he deeply influenced people like Crottier, W.E.B. Du Bois.
Right.
But as philosophical trends shifted, so you have pragmatism
Right.
coming to the fore, you have relativism in various forms.
Right.
His voice, which had been so prominent, kind of receded
Right.
into the background. A
Interesting.
very rationalist voice.
Okay. Well, so, to better appreciate his thought, let's sketch out his life a little bit.
Sure.
So, Crummell was born free in New York City in 1819.
Okay.
His parents, themselves had kind of interesting stories about freedom. His mother was born free, and his father was originally from the Temne people of West Africa,
Okay.
but had been enslaved
Okay.
before obtaining his liberty. Wow.
So, his emergence, I guess, as a public intellectual kind of coincided with his marriage in 1841.
Okay.
But even before that, you can see the promise because he delivers the keynote address at the 1840 New York State Convention of Negroes, which was, very focused on, the abolitionist cause.
Okay. Interesting.
So, and, demonstrating kind of a really kind of interesting resilience
Yeah.
against, the racial barriers of his time.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
Crummell became an Episcopal priest.
Okay.
And, in his pursuit of knowledge, this leads him to theological studies at Yale.
Okay.
And then, crucially, I think, for his philosophical development,
Yeah.
to Cambridge.
Oh, wow.
To Cambridge University,
Okay.
where he studies moral philosophy under William Whewell.
Okay. Yeah.
Now, Whewell is a really, for people who know the history of philosophy, really important thinker because he had this intuitionist approach
Right.
to moral reasoning.
Right. This idea that we can sort of intuit
Just
moral truths,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
That are necessary.
Exactly.
Which really shaped Crummell's thought.
Right. So he's got this serious academic pedigree behind him
Yeah.
that leads into this.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And he eventually earned his bachelor's from Queen's College at Cambridge.
Oh, wow.
So pretty serious.
Yeah.
But so, after his time at Cambridge, he really actively participates in the anti-slavery movement.
Right.
But then a real significant, I think, chapter in his life is he moves to Liberia,
Okay.
where he actually serves as a professor of English and moral philosophy at Liberia College.
Wow.
And despite the various challenges he faces there, this is really intellectually fertile time.
Yeah.
During his time in Liberia, this is where he pens his first book, The Future of Africa, in 1862,
Okay.
which has these early glimpses of his thought on, morality and language.
Right.
And later works like The Greatness of Christ in 1882 and Africa and America in 1891. You can see a kind of more mature and a more nuanced Crummell developing.
Right. Okay.
Yeah, so in his later years, after, sadly, the passing of his first wife,
Okay.
he remarries,
Okay.
and he holds a lectureship at Howard University.
Okay.
But I think maybe his most lasting impact is co-founding the American Negro Academy in 1897.
Right.
And this was really pivotal because this was a group of, leading Black intellectuals, including Du Bois and later Elaine Leroy Locke. And it was dedicated to producing scholarship on, the issues facing, Black communities.
Right.
And sadly, the Academy was relatively short-lived. It disbanded in the 1920s, but still it's just a testament to his commitment.
Absolutely, yeah.
To rigorous thought.
Yeah.
So Crummell himself dies in 1898.
Okay.
So, for you, the listener, who really engages, with philosophical questions, I think the central thread we're going to be kind of pulling on today is Crummell's just really powerful defense of reason.
Yes.
Right? We're going to look at how this commitment to rationality informed his approach to a bunch of really, I think, fundamental philosophical problems.
Right.
Like, what are the inherent contradictions surrounding civil rights in his era? Like, what is moral reasoning?
Right.
Like, what motivates moral action?
Right.
And then this really complicated dynamic of moral change.
Absolutely.
So, consider this our deep dive into the intellectual world of Alexander Crummell.
Let's do it.
Okay.
All right. So let's begin by thinking about what we might call the problem of civil rights as Crummell faced it. So imagine, right, being a Black person in 19th century America.
Right.
Whether enslaved or, nominally free.
Right.
And you're in a nation that claims to be founded on ideals of legal and political equality.
Right.
So you can see that right there, there's a philosophical dissonance.
A huge dissonance.
It's a huge dissonance.
Yeah.
And this is especially acute, right, because the Constitution itself, as Crummell was aware, implicitly sanctioned slavery.
Right.
By recognizing enslaved people as primarily a form of labor.
Right.
So it's built in,
Yeah.
It's built into the structure.
Totally. And, as the Stanford Encyclopedia entry we've been consulting points out, the legal interpretations of the time, particularly within slavery-era courts, were very narrow.
Oh, yeah.
In terms of, any semblance of legal rights.
Absolutely.
For Black individuals.
Yeah.
So it wasn't enough to just say, well, this is unjust.
Right.
Because you've got the language of the Constitution. You've got, this very complex common law.
Right. Exactly. Exactly. A lot of, really intricate arguments going on in the courts to kind of support this institution.
Right.
So you have to come up with something strong to counter that.
Exactly. And Crummell recognized this, right? So any argument that was contingent on partial considerations or consequentialist reasoning, for instance, well, Black people deserve rights because of their contributions to the nation.
Right, yeah.
He was like, no.
That's not going to work.
That's not stable.
Yeah.
Because those things can change.
Exactly. They're contingent, right.
Exactly.
Public opinion could shift.
Totally.
What's useful at one point may not be useful later.
Exactly. And this is his insight that I think is so profound and so philosophically resonant.
Yeah.
Is that he's like, look, fundamental rights by their nature must be universal and non-partial.
Exactly. Yeah. They can't be tied to some particular outcome.
Exactly.
Or consequence. It has to be much deeper than that.
Yeah.
Much more fundamental.
Yeah.
So this led him to develop what he called his natural rights argument, which is really his solution to this problem.
Okay.
And his idea is that rights, they don't originate right from the whims of legal systems.
Right.
Or, the fluctuations of public sentiment.
Right.
They have this much, what he calls a higher origin.
Right.
A purer birth. They exist prior to.
Right.
And independent of any man-made laws.
Mm-hmm.
So for Crummell, rights aren't granted.
Right.
They are inherent.
Okay, yeah.
They're part of what it means to be the kind of being.
Right.
That can have rights.
Right.
And he argues that these inherent rights, they can be inferred from what he calls the settled and primary sentiments of human nature.
Okay.
Our fundamental human experiences and our kind of exalted tendencies.
Right.
And, the text really nicely uses the Amistad case.
Oh, yeah.
To illustrate this.
Yeah.
Right? So you have the Africans on board the Amistad, and they weren't U.S. citizens, right?
Right.
But, they had the right to defend themselves against the injustice.
Of course.
Of being kidnapped.
Yeah.
Enslaved.
Right.
And this right to self-defense, Crummell would argue, it wasn't just some novel legal thing. It stemmed from this universal human response to a really profound wrong that predates any specific legal code.
Right. It's pre-legal.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And the key link in Crummell's argument is this.
Yeah.
He says, Any being endowed with the light of reason
Okay.
and its exalted attributes inherently possesses certain rights.
Okay.
Just by virtue of, having that rational nature.
Yeah.
So for Crummell, reason is like the foundation on which rights are built.
Okay. Yeah.
So now the question for him becomes, are Black people, beings that possess this light of reason?
Right.
And he offers two forms of defense. One, a kind of positive argument.
Right.
The other, negative one.
Okay.
So his positive defense is what he calls the common sympathies premise.
Okay.
He says that Black people's political sensibilities, their understanding of political situations, and their aspirations for political outcomes are fundamentally the same as any other groups. This shared capacity for political understanding, for him, implies a shared underlying capacity for reason.
Right.
They're not different in kind.
Right.
Right. They just happen to be, in this particular situation.
Right.
Then his negative defense, he uses the very denial of Black people's rights.
Okay.
Their disenfranchisement.
Right.
As a kind of strategic point.
Okay.
So he gives us two premises.
Okay.
So the first disenfranchisement premise is that when you deny political rights, it creates these, yearnings and longings for them.
Yeah.
And he says, look, this isn't unique to any group.
Right.
It's just human social nature.
Right.
That if you're disenfranchised,
Right.
you're going to yearn for.
For what's being denied you.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So the fact that Black people desired political participation in the same way any other disenfranchised population would suggested this shared humanity.
Right.
And this shared rationality.
Right. Yeah.
They're not content with being, excluded.
Right.
And then the second disenfranchisement premise is that this denial of rights, it leads to indignities
Right.
and wrongs that provoke this sense of moral discomfort in Black people.
Right.
And this moral response to injustice, he argues, is indicative of their capacity for moral reasoning.
Right.
Now, we should flag this because this is like a philosophical challenge,
yes.
as the text points out.
Yeah.
Could these premises actually presuppose the conclusion,
Right.
which is that Black people are fully human and deserving of rights?
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Because you could say, well, look, to identify disenfranchisement as a wrong, you might already be assuming that that group has the moral standing to be wronged.
Right.
So it's a really interesting point.
That's a good point. Yeah.
But the text gives us kind of a more subtle way of reading the second disenfranchisement premise,
Okay.
which is that Crummell's not just saying, oh, look, Black people feel bad when they're marginalized. Right. He's saying they understand their response to this marginalization as a moral wrong.
Okay.
That act of interpretation, of framing their experience within a moral framework, that presupposes moral agency.
Right. So it's not just that they're like sad or
exactly, or like they're having a bad psychological experience.
Exactly. They're like, no, this is wrong.
They're saying this is unjust.
Right. Yeah.
This violates some principle.
Yeah.
And that itself requires
A moral framework.
a moral framework. Exactly.
Right. Yeah.
So it's a really nice.
That's a subtle point.
Yeah, it's a very subtle point.
Yeah, that's a good.
And it's a powerful one.
Yeah. Yeah.
Because it means he's not just recognizing them as sentient beings
Right.
who are reacting to stimuli.
Right.
He's recognizing them as rational beings capable of moral judgment, ethical evaluation.
Right.
You can't say, oh, well, they're just, upset because of outside agitators.
Right.
No, they themselves are, like, evaluating the situation
Yeah.
and finding it wanting.
Right. Yeah.
So that leads Crummell to this powerful conclusion, which is that Black Americans are justified in claiming equal and entire rights grounded in this common humanity.
Right.
And this is really a bold argument for its time.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's an early but very philosophically sophisticated
Yeah.
underpinning for, the burgeoning fight for Black civil rights.
Right.
So that's the problem of civil rights.
Yeah.
Let's shift now to what we might call the problem of moral reason, as Crummell understood it.
Okay.
So he saw the human psyche, right, as having this tripartite structure.
Okay.
You have instinct, passion, and reason.
Right.
And reason for him is primary,
Okay.
right? But reason for him isn't just something you acquire,
Right.
like through education.
Right.
It's something much more fundamental.
Okay.
He calls it a universal and native sentiment, a kind of inherent, deep-felt knowledge, a spontaneous ability to discern truth.
Interesting.
So it's like they're from the start in some way, right?
Yeah.
Now, he contrasts this with, like, a kind of more deliberative form of reason that requires the cultivation of intellectual and moral powers.
Okay.
And this is where he sees a role for education.
Right.
And religion.
Okay.
So he thinks these institutions can help us kind of perceive what he calls, those awful truths, those eternal principles.
Right.
So for Crummell, moral reason is this kind of cultivated ability that allows for an almost immediate grasp of moral truths.
Okay.
It's like you see it, you know it.
Yeah.
You don't have to go through a lot of syllogisms or, calculation.
Right.
It's just
there. Okay. Yeah.
Now, the text points out, you could see some philosophical influences here.
Yeah.
So there's definitely a Platonic echo.
Right.
When he talks about, like, intuiting these abstract pre-existing moral entities, like the timeless principles that exist independent of our experience.
Right.
But then you also see this Aristotelian element.
Right.
He's interested in practical morality.
Right.
Developing virtuous habits.
Right.
And he admires seemingly effortless moral action.
Right.
The text gives the example of his friend Sidney.
Right.
Right, who just seemed to act, like, morally.
Right.
Without much effort.
Right. Right.
So there's this really interesting tension and maybe a synthesis going on here.
Right.
Especially when you think about, the constrained agency of, say, enslaved Black people.
Yeah. It's like he admires the moral clarity he sees in individuals like Sidney.
Right.
But he also recognizes the necessity for conscious effort.
Absolutely, yeah.
And principled reasoning.
Yes, exactly.
Especially when you're dealing with injustice.
Because your intuitions might lead you astray.
Right, right.
They might have been corrupted.
Right.
Shaped in the wrong way.
Exactly. So you have to kind of really think it through.
Right.
Yeah.
And he maintained that even amidst all this complexity of human life, that reason can still get to these fundamental moral principles.
Yeah.
He even invoked providence to suggest that there's this divine order that ultimately helps us achieve this moral clarity.
Oh, okay. Okay. Yeah.
So this leads us to something really interesting. And I think, as philosophers, we should be interested in this.
Yeah.
Which is his philosophy of language.
Okay. Yeah.
And how it connects to moral reasoning.
Right.
So he firmly, and we should say, problematically by today's standards, he analyzes the Grebo language spoken in West Africa.
Yeah.
And he argues that it's ill-equipped for rational thought.
Okay.
Especially moral thought.
Right.
Because of what he sees as fundamental defects.
Interesting.
So he describes it as harsh, abrupt, meager in point of words, characterized by inarticulate nasal and guttural sound.
Oh, wow. Yeah.
And he relied heavily on the descriptions of the missionary John L. Wilson.
Right.
In coming to this conclusion.
Okay, interesting.
And he thinks that this lack of linguistic sophistication is connected to what he sees as, quote, lowness of ideas with brutal and vindictive sentiments.
All right.
And hindering the development of abstract moral reasoning in Grebo speakers.
Okay, yeah.
And so his reasoning here, as the text points out, is really rooted in Lockean philosophical principles.
Right.
So for him, words represent thoughts.
Right.
And language is a tool for thinking.
Yeah.
It's like an externalized memory system
for
our ideas.
Right.
So if a language has defects in its structure and vocabulary, it's going to impede the ability of its speakers to form and manipulate complex moral concepts.
Okay, yeah.
He was concerned that Grebo might not be able to handle, like, abstract notions of justice, political organization.
Or the nature of the divine.
Okay.
So, as philosophers, we should, I think, note the contrast with what was going on at the time in comparative linguistics.
Right, yeah.
People like Humboldt.
Yeah, Humboldt, right.
Are exploring, like, the underlying universal structures of language.
Yeah.
We're looking for patterns across linguistic systems.
Right.
But there's not much evidence that Crummell knew about this.
Yeah.
His focus is within this Lockean framework
that
emphasizes this direct and kind of simple relationship between the structure of a language and the cognitive abilities of its speakers.
Right, yeah.
And so this leads him to advocate for, Black people in Africa to adopt English because he thinks this will give them the tools to overcome these limitations and engage in more abstract moral reasoning.
Okay.
So this is from a modern perspective, this is a real ethical and intellectual challenge because you have to say, like, wasn't he ignoring the impact of history and politics on cognitive development and the evolution of linguistic practices?
Right, exactly.
I mean, if there were diminished cognitive resources, wasn't that because of, things like slavery?
Yeah, exactly. Slavery and other forms of oppression.
Yeah.
Right? Like, why focus on these supposed intrinsic limitations?
Yeah.
When there are these, morally reprehensible social conditions that are shaping people.
Yeah.
And, the text asks a really good question, which is, why didn't Crummell, who was so eloquent on the injustice of civil rights violations, connect these cognitive challenges more explicitly to slavery and oppression?
Yeah.
Right? Why not make that link?
Right.
Now, maybe, and this is just speculation, but maybe it was because the understanding of the connection between the environment and linguistic development was just, not as sophisticated then as it is now. Right. So he might have seen these linguistic characteristics as more fundamental, less subject to external influence.
Right.
Like, he wasn't thinking in terms of plasticity of the brain.
Right.
And, environmental factors.
Right.
As much as we do now.
Right.
But regardless of his reasons, he definitely thought civilization required robust cognitive and linguistic resources.
Right.
And he thought those were primarily cultivated through public discourse.
Right.
Conducted in a language.
Right.
That could express complex ideas.
Right.
So this aligns with his vision of what we might call foreshadowing Du Bois' talented 10th.
Right.
This idea of like an intellectual elite.
Right.
That is necessary for the uplift of the community.
Right.
And, he thought slavery had really damaged Black people's ability to generate these resources.
Right.
And so his focus was on rebuilding them, not so much on placing blame for their absence, which was more, Douglas's concern.
Right.
So I think it's important to remember that while, theories of inherent language-based cognitive deficiencies are now discredited, Crummell's analysis, flawed as it is, gives us this insight into how people thought about language and race in the 19th century.
Right.
And the role it was thought to play.
Yeah.
In Black reasoning.
Right.
And discourse.
Yeah.
Okay. So let's move on to the problem of motivation.
Okay.
So for Crummell, moral reasoning, so that ability to discern right from wrong, had to be connected to effective agency, the ability to act on that knowledge.
Right.
And he explored this connection through 3 arguments: the mental principle argument, the moral principle argument, and the memory versus recall argument.
Okay.
Let's start with the mental principle argument.
Okay.
So he says the idea of God that a people holds has a transformative power on their character.
Okay.
It can elevate or it can debase them.
Okay.
And he sees this direct correlation between a clear and right and grand conception of God and national greatness. For Crummell, the idea of God is the generative principle of mental activity.
Okay.
It's what drives all the various endeavors of a flourishing civil society.
Right.
And it magnifies a nation's mind. So it shapes their cultural and intellectual horizons.
Okay.
And it's not just about divine intervention, right?
Right.
It's about how the concept of the divine shapes our aspirations, values,
Right.
intellectual pursuits.
Right.
And this ultimately contributes to the formation of a lasting and significant nation. And he suggests that Black people, with their plastic nature,
Okay.
their historical resilience,
Right.
their patience, are actually well suited for this long-term
Okay.
legacy-building endeavor, guided by a powerful idea of God.
Right.
And he rejects the idea that nations are just random groups of individuals. He says, no, they're cohesive social entities,
Right.
bound together.